Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. Isn't it exciting that we're here in person, even though we're quite distanced and it looks like we don't have very many people in the audience, but in fact we're pretty full in terms of these COVID times. My name's Amanda McDonald and I'm not on your program as the facilitator for today's session. Nicole Abadee was, but unfortunately she's not well, so I've stepped in. I think that Catherine asked me to do it, and I was telling Jess, because when I read Jess's book, See What You Made Me Do, I read it through when we were locked down, and I read mostly sort of in the middle of the night, and each morning at the breakfast table, my husband would be regaled with the chapter or chapters that I had read, the stories, the stats, the studies, the unbelievable things that I just found incredibly readable in Jess's book. So I think that I had a little bit to do with actually the festival inviting Jess. It wasn't anything to do with her wonderful book. So we'll be talking about domestic abuse and exploring hopefully a little bit about what can be done. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. In these COVID times, I'd like to do a little bit of admin before we get into the session. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that there aren't that many people in the room. That's due to social distancing. There's hand sanitizer available at the door, and we really do encourage you to comply with the health orders and to remain 1.5 metres apart. Just in terms of normal admin, please mute your mobile phones and don't record the session. And if you are taking photos, please turn off the flash. We'd really encourage you to share on social media at Bad Crime Sydney, hashtag Bad Crime Sydney, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. So please be thinking of those through the session. We'll be glad to get to them. I'm very happy to be able to introduce our panel today. Firstly, Jess Hill, who is an investigative journalist who's been researching and writing about domestic abuse since 2014, which is an incredibly long time to be immersed in the subject in the way that you have, Jess. You've won 2 Walkley Awards, an Amnesty International Award, and 3 Our Watch Awards for her reporting on domestic abuse. As we mentioned, Jess has spent many years, 4 years, writing this wonderful book, and she did win the Stella Prize in 2020, and it's now out in the US and the UK. I didn't know this until yesterday because I actually read the book on my Kindle, but Helen Garner has described it as a shattering book, clear-headed, meticulous, driving always at the truth. Golly, I wish I could write like that. Our other panellist has the most impressive CV. Lindel Garland, thank you so much for coming today. Lyndal is the principal solicitor at Gowland Legal, which she established in 2010, and is dedicated to protecting women and children from domestic abuse. She's worked in the field for 30 years as a passionate advocate for social justice, law reform, and the end of domestic violence, making multiple submissions to law reform bodies. In 2016, she founded the Gowland Awards to acknowledge the strength of survivors and to celebrate frontline advocates. And in 2020, she founded Lawyers Against DV and Abuse. Do you actually sleep? Lyndal, I wouldn't mind starting with you, if that's okay, talking about the Gowland Awards. Could you tell us about them, why you established them, and what you think the benefit of having them is?
Certainly, the Gowland Awards we established in 2016 to celebrate, firstly, the resistance, the acts of strength of domestic violence domestic abuse survivors and victims across Australia. We recognise that survivors and victims were getting portrayed as weak, and we thought that actually didn't portray accurately the trauma that women and children were facing every day. And it did not, our view was that when victim and survivors recognised that what they had was strength, that would empower them to take a step that they thought was safe. So there's that aspect, very important aspect to the Gowland Awards. We have, on the night, we have an award, the Active Client of Resistance. That is given to an agency that has nominated, that has told us about a particular story. We don't ever identify who owns that story, because whilst it is about one act, the idea is to acknowledge the strength, the acts of resistance that go on each and every day, each and every moment, to keep women and children safe from being killed and safe from harm. The other aspect of the Gowland Awards is also very important. It's about celebrating, acknowledging the work, the tireless work, the thankless work, the relentless work of the domestic abuse workers across Australia. It is a field that is undervalued, that also they don't get not only is it undervalued, but it is often degraded. When a worker goes out, domestic violence workers tell me all the time that they can't go out and have lunch or something and have a discussion about their work, because invariably you'll get somebody go, oh yeah, but what about the poor man? Or why didn't she leave? Right, so their work is not supported on a micro level, and so we thought, our idea was, we were going to name it, we were going to call it what their work is warriors to protect women and children from violence, and we hold it in Parliament House deliberately to recognise that how important the work is, how important the work of domestic violence workers is, and that it is a state issue. The fact that, it is the state that controls the laws, the state that controls the policies that keep women and children unsafe. The other benefits that we've seen, fantastic benefits we've seen come from the Gowland Awards, is the support. We've had reports that people that work in the field, when they see that there's this large group of like-minded people, that is reassuring and invigorating. The other thing that we've learnt more recently is that it has started little warrior groups across Australia. So we'll have people that have come to the awards, and then they'll come up to us and go, oh, we've just started this group. Because when we were here, we heard how people, women and men, were making changes and forming advocacy groups. So it is. This is our 5th year, and it's growing in influence, and it's growing in its level of support. So we're very proud of it. I'm very proud of my team that does all the work all year.
It sounds amazing. Thanks, Lyndal. I don't think I can go any further without mentioning some horrific stats from Jess's book. One I was very familiar with because it's in the media all the time, but the other two I really didn't know about. So the first one was, one Australian woman a week is killed by a man she has been intimate with. I think that there's been quite a lot of media around that. The second one was, in 2017, 1/3 of all women killed around the world were killed by an intimate partner. I didn't realise that stat. The third one was the one that alarmed me considerably, and I kept asking myself, could it be true? But I know how well-researched this book is, so I do know. In Australia, every 2 minutes, police are called out to a domestic dispute. Jess, why do I find that so unbelievable?
I think because the scope of it is unbelievable. I think even after spending, the last 6 years really immersed in it, I actually still can't quite grapple with the scope of it, because it's kind of impossible to integrate that it would be happening to so many people. And, as we were talking about backstage, like, the stat we have is that fewer than 20% of victims experiencing abuse right now have ever reported to police. And of course, those police call-outs will be responding to neighbours and a bunch of other people who will call because they've heard something or know something is happening. But we can presume that amount of police call-outs is really only dealing with 40 to 50% maximum of the domestic violence that is happening in Australia. So, as said in the book, like, imagine if everyone started reporting. I mean, like, it literally, we just wouldn't have the system to cope with that. And it won't happen like that, because not everyone is going to report to police. And for some people, it's not appropriate for them to report to police for all different reasons. But yeah, I just think the enormous scope of it, it sort of really struck me that, I've for a long time, since I was a little girl, really, I've believed myself to be a feminist. It's not a very controversial thing to say now, but on the northern beaches, in the 90s, there weren't too many overt feminists, and I think it's hard to look at another area that is as important as fighting violence against women and their children to the project of feminism and gender equality, because if you've got 1 in 4 women who've experienced physical or sexual violence from a partner, and what we know is that in coercive control there actually may never be physical or sexual violence that someone can actually put their finger on and report in a survey. But so let's just take that 1 in 4, that's about 2.3 million women in Australia who have had to deal with being abused and degraded and having their lives threatened and all of the things that come with that, and having their opportunities and access to being able to thrive severely diminished. Like, you just can't have a gender equality project without something that puts domestic violence at the centre of it.
Thanks, Jess. It is so alarming. Lyndal, you've lived this. Are you happy to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I lived it. I survived domestic violence and I flourish. I'm proud to say I'm proud to say I flourished. I'm proud to say that I'm a survivor. It's the first time that I've ever said this in public, but I think it's important that we get that word out there, that this is what a survivor can look like, right? And that domestic violence, domestic abuse happens across every socio-economic level, as we know, every culture, every religion, wherever you are, domestic abuse is prevalent, unfortunately. But what it does is, I'm a family lawyer, I'm a passionate family lawyer. Gowland Legal is trauma-informed practice. So I have taken my experience, my experience, my children's experience, and that informs the work that we do. So I can take the theory, the Gowland Legal can take the theory, and we can look at it, how that affects a trauma survivor. So it has helped my experience, my survival has, I believe, has saved children's lives, has saved women's lives, because we know what to look for. We know that trust has to be formed with anybody, with your solicitor. It's very important. So we know how to gather the evidence. Where unfortunately, a lot of, well, it's perfectly expected that, given that domestic abuse has been so secret, such in private, that it is not well known how to gather the evidence that courts require. Courts should rely on evidence, but as a survivor, as a firm that is dedicated to getting women and children safe, women not to be impoverished, that we need to really be careful and not just go, oh no, she hasn't told me, she hasn't mentioned it, she hasn't said suffers domestic violence, she hasn't said that. Oh, okay, but who controls the money? Who's she's nervous about where she is and she can't say. She doesn't. He talks to her family. She doesn't talk. They're all okay. So okay, this is what we need to ask a bit more here. We need to be really careful, and that is what my experience as a domestic violence survivor, a flourisher in this universe, has brought to the practice, and I firmly believe it has helped literally save women and children's lives. I'm looking at them in my eye, and not only that, on a less serious level, there are we have the Gowland Legal has got cases, significant cases in the court that has allowed women's voices to be heard about the violence, has challenged the court about what needs to happen to keep women and children safe. So this is our ongoing work, our ongoing passion, and Gowland Legal will continue to be dedicated, proudly so, to that. So today I'm saying I'm a proud survivor of domestic abuse.
Yay.
And now I'm done. Can I just say that's just hats off to you for saying that in public, and I think that tells us how far we've come in the last few years too, that this is something now that I think women should be proud that they have survived, that it shows resilience and strategic natures, and that's something that's a narrative that is really starting to thrive, especially after Me Too. And also that, women like yourself, as lawyers, but also as magistrates, are literally changing the way that this is being put through the courts. And I've done a bunch of education with the Judicial College in Victoria, which is a really amazing education body for magistrates. And it's often after we would do the formally in-person sessions, with a room full of magistrates, and afterwards we'd be having tea and, have women and men come up and talk about, how do I sort of stop myself from colluding with the perpetrator in the courtroom? How do I, they're really seeking to be better. But so many women, and when I say so many, I'm thinking maybe 4 or 5 in a room of magistrates of like 20, are survivors and are using the law in a way that is innovative to do things like, if there is a family law order that is dangerous for children, they are using stuff around intervention orders to override that. Now, that's almost unheard of for a lot of, because if you don't know, a family law order that orders children to see a parent who may be, have had convictions, but that the child may be terrified of, that traditionally overrides an intervention order that may actually restrict that parent from seeing the child. So you have these two court systems that can be at odds with each other, and in terms of determining whether that parent is safe or not. And I had not heard any state-based magistrate, any local magistrate say, well, actually, even if there's a family law order in place, I will put a stop contact order in. And that innovation is coming from survivors as magistrates in Victoria. So it's no small thing to see. When we talk about gender equality in these areas, you're also talking about equality of experience, not just equality, of sex-based equality, and the sorts of experience they're bringing is changing the way that the law is prosecuted.
I think that that's a really good place for us to perhaps jump into some of the law areas before we go back to some of the other areas that we need to explore. But we talked before a little bit about the family law system, and I have experience with Federal Circuit Court judges, but in a completely different jurisdiction, in migration and refugee law, and there were some alarming stories in those jurisdictions, but it is a completely different sort of jurisdiction to the family law jurisdiction. We now have the amalgamation between the Federal Circuit Court and the Family Court, which is meant to solve all of the problems. Will it solve the problems that we've talked about?
What do you think, Lyndal?
Well, I think no, to be perfectly honest. I think it's a cultural problem. So whatever you call the courts, it's still the same ideas. It's the same framework. It's one of the reasons I just thank you, Jess, for this book. As a survivor and as a lawyer, I thank you for this book because it does justice to survivors. You feel survivors' pain in this book, but it is it's a forensic analysis of what we could be doing, and I think it will encourage lawyers. I speak, my concern's lawyers. I think it will encourage lawyers to go, we can do this, because it is seen so hard. It is seen in my profession to be so hard. Even really good lawyers that want to respect the victim survivor's experience. The law is, in my view, is so structured against really recognising how to keep women and children safe. Jess's idea to change, to call domestic coercive and control, to be identified as domestic abuse. That's a big start because, in my view, the family court's framework, and this is what I think it will translate to whatever they want to call a court. The family law's framework is that domestic violence is really only really serious when it's physical. Only really serious when it's physical. Even though we have all the definitions that kind of look a bit like coercive control, that's the benchmark, right? And when it's physical, then often what happens is, you've separated. It'll be all fine. It'll be all fine, right? You don't, and this happens in the children's court, the care courts as well. But let me stick to family court. It's so I think that what I would, if I was in charge, I would love to be in charge of the family court. If I was in charge, I would upend the family court completely, and I would say, let's look at the reality that what matters come into the family court are, in the vast majority, domestic abuse cases. They're not the minority. The minority, in my practice, we have a lot of matters of consent. Nobody wants to really waste money on lawyers. Nobody wants a legal bill for fun. So it's the domestic abuse cases. They're the ones that hit the court. They're the ones that need the attention. And yet, as Jess so reports in here, in her book, that the courts, the evidence, so the courts don't, in my view, what we should have is, as soon as there's a matter filed in the court, social workers should be assigned to the parties. But particularly the applicant. But social workers should be assigned to the parties. But social workers, psychologists or family consultants that have actual expertise in domestic abuse. Not, I have seen a number, or I have seen, which is what you hear. Oh yeah, no, I know all about domestic abuse. I have a few clients. I've seen a few clients.
You don't think us lawyers are going to be good at that?
Sorry?
You don't think us lawyers are going to be that good at that?
We're
not as good as the social workers and the experts.
Well, no, I think it is a place, when I talk about parenting, I think it is a place for family consultants, right?
I think we're better at dealing with some of the issues about the money as opposed to... I think if you look at where lawyers have come from and their training, I'm very glad to hear that there are some magistrates getting some good training. But that's not the normal training, is it?
No, that's right. It's not the normal training. And also there's the structures. There's time constraints for the family court, for lawyers that are trying to do the right thing. You can, if you want to go to court, to get an urgent application, there's often a limit of 2 hours. 2 hours to have a complex case. That's just impossible. There's more recent constraints put that limit the capacity of lawyers to provide evidence to the court. We only get, in recent times we've been told we are only allowed to have 10 pages of evidence, right? 10 pages. A case for us would be 40 pages or something at that initial stage. So just imagine that you can only say a quarter of what you really need to hear. And then later on, if it goes to trial, what happens is the other side gets to say, oh, you didn't say all that when you started. You didn't say all that. You're only just making that up now. This is all new. You're making that up. So there's these constraints. So we have a lot of, I think the family law in a lot of respects is fantastic. But it is the application of it. It's the failure to recognise that we really need to be looking at this as if everybody that needs the help of the courts is likely to be subject to harm, psychological harm, physical harm, coercive control, or to being killed. Killed. So that's my clearly strong view.
I think what Lyndal says about really having to totally take a entirely new approach to family law is really important, and it was something that I hadn't thought as much about before, but perhaps it's because family law and the whole family law system can be quite sort of confounding as to like, why are these dangerous outcomes coming out of this system? Aren't children supposed to be protected in this system, etc.? It's important to understand, so how did the family law system start? It started in 1975, obviously. It came out of the Royal Commission into Human Relationships, which is such a like 70s, type of thing. But the Whitlam government, commissioning this Royal Commission to find out what was going on behind closed doors, like literally, and finding out that actually the testimonies of Australians were revealing that a lot of people were living in secret gay relationships, a lot of people were having illegal abortions, a lot of people were experiencing severe domestic violence, etc., etc. And so one of the things that came out of that Royal Commission was the family law system. So in 1975, you get no-fault divorce for the first time, so your divorces aren't being splashed on the tabloid front pages, and it becomes a private matter. So you get a particular section of the Family Law Act, Section 121, which says that you can't actually talk about what is happening inside the case and be identified because you need to have privacy for the rights of children and stuff, so it's not all, tabloid and scandal. And so from the very beginning, like no-fault divorce is at the heart of it. As a result of that, when women can get divorces, suddenly they start getting divorces at a much faster rate. And what do you get that year? The first domestic violence refuge, Elsie's in Glebe. So you're dealing with a court that started off before we even really had a term for what was happening in these households. It was wife beating, it was, and before we saw women and children in their thousands start fleeing their homes and going to these abandoned houses that were being sort of taken over by feminist squatters who were turning them into refuges. So that's how it started. And, for a while there, it sort of carried on dealing with domestic violence, putting children's safety as the sort of top priority. And then in the 80s, there was some research that started coming out that was all about children do better when they, after the parents have separated, if they have contact with the fathers, that it's not good for children just to be going with the mothers, because, of course, a lot of these decisions, or not even decisions, a lot of what would happen after a separation is the children would go with the mother primarily. The mother was often the primary attachment figure, so scientifically we know for young children that's actually probably important. But also, a lot of the time the fathers didn't want to be a primary caregiver for the children. But this scientific research, so-called, started to change the way that the family law courts were coming at it. The problem was when they were looking at research about do children fare better with contact with fathers after a separation, well, of course that would be true if the fathers were caregivers. But where there's violence, of course, that is not true. But that research started to override that just common sense approach that the court had been taking. And by the 90s, you start to see, after a few changes that the Keating government started to make, you start to see a reversal in the way that the courts are dealing with these issues. Where domestic abuse and sexual abuse is alleged or even proven, it's actually getting a lot harder for the protective parent to get the court to order no contact between the child and the alleged or even convicted parent. And as you get through the 2000s, and certainly with the Howard government and the changes that they made to the Family Law Act at the behest of anti-feminist men's rights groups, is that you get to a point where actually, through the hostile parent provision, if a parent was to allege abuse against the other parent, they could be seen as a hostile parent, not supportive of their child's relationship with the other parent, and be penalised by the family law courts for that. And you start having women not only being advised by their lawyers not to bring up domestic abuse because it will count against them, but having their children taken away from them and handed to the alleged abuser or even convicted abuser for trying to press for no contact. And it was like, when I started researching this, which was in 2015, I had somebody call me. I was actually doing a background briefing on perpetrators at the time, and I was in Melbourne. And I had a call from someone who was reporting that she had, based on her children's wishes, presented allegations of sexual abuse from the father towards the children to the court. And in a secret hearing, the judge had decided, with the help of a report writer, that her children should be removed without notice. Her children were removed from school the next day with no notice given to her. She wasn't even aware of the court proceedings. The principal called them to the office. The father arrived, took the children away. No contact with the mother for 2 months. No contact with the grandparents for 5 months. This is a mother who had been assessed in the report written by a certain psychiatrist, that she was a good mother, except for the fact that she was attempting to destroy the children's relationship with the father. She had her children disappear from her life for 2 months entirely. They could not even call her. And when she said that to me, I was like, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. This is a court of law. That's impossible. And I thought, it sounds a bit like one of those, must be a mother's right groups, like sort of the same as the father's rights groups, coming up with crazy stuff that once I read the documents, I'll see that didn't happen. And then I read the documents, and that's exactly what happened. And it was literally the report writer saying to the judge, I advise that the children be removed immediately and without notice to avoid a scene. And the children, according to the principal's testimony, went to the office. The daughter said, like with a look of horror on her face, said, how long are we going to have to stay with him? The principal said, I don't know. And the principal said later in testimony, I fear that those children's trust of me has been forever broken, because what he saw on their faces was fear. So that first story for me was like, there is something seriously wrong here. Maybe this is just an anomaly. But I started going back through all of the reports dating back to 99, all these academic reports, even reports funded by the family court, even reports written by a former family court judge, talking about this trend, that this is a trend, that not only were women being advised not to report domestic abuse, but they were having children actually taken away from them. And we have a situation where only 3% of custody cases end up with an order of no contact. So this is an extremely rare order, and yet I have met so many women who have had their children removed by the family law courts for pressing allegations of domestic abuse. But even so, 83% of cases where there are allegations or proven histories of domestic violence end up with orders of shared parenting. Now, that doesn't mean that they get shared custody, but it does mean that every important decision has to be agreed to by both parties. Can you imagine agreeing on every major parenting decision with someone who registered high for narcissistic traits, for someone who had maybe raped you, for someone who had abused your children, for someone who was continuing to control and taking great glee in controlling your every move, who would make sure that you couldn't move out of the immediate area in which they lived, so that you can't actually move to a place where you might have family support or financial support. That's what we're dealing with in Australia right now. That is actually the system that people go into when they go into a custody case. Primarily, you get women, I'm sure you've heard lots of women come to you like this, so, and some men too, saying that, okay, I've been taken, you know, he or she wants to take me to family law court. So what's going to happen now? I've got this evidence. We can present, you know, how they've been abusive during... And what you have to inform them is that, okay, you may get a judge who will understand it. Fortunately, if they get you, they have a lawyer who understands it. But it's a bit of a crapshoot. And you can't say to them, this is a system that will protect your children. And, you know, going back to that, those sessions with the Judicial College, I was introduced to one magistrate who, as a barrister, stayed for 10 years with her husband after the first day that she saw him physically abuse her son, knowing that she wanted to leave at that very moment, but also knowing that she could not rely on the courts to protect her child. So she stayed in the marriage as a supervisor because she knew that given there was no criminal background, like no criminal history of domestic violence, she couldn't prove it apart from coercive control, you know, which is very hard for the judges to really acknowledge, that he would end up being unsupervised with that parent, and she was afraid that he would kill him. So, and I can't tell you how many, I get so many emails, and Rosie Batty said to me several years ago, if it weren't for the family law courts, I would literally receive barely any emails from survivors. It is the number one thing people email me about, and they are emailing me, begging me to protect their children.
I barely know what to say to that. It is just so alarming. One of the things, though, that alarmed me when I talked to people about your book, Jess, people who haven't read it, I might say, there's often this flippant comment, but isn't there a large number of women who are making up these allegations? And I wanted to just ask you, that is definitely not what your research bears out, but how do we deal with that, or how has that developed that really educated, thinking people are still saying that?
Including me. I used to think that. Like, I used to think, yeah, of course, that would be the easiest route to getting an advantage in the custody, in the family courts. And it's not like no one does. And it's not like... The point is, it's not that there aren't, you know, women who feel bitter and vengeful making up crap in the family law courts. Of course that happens. But the funny thing is we've always talked about women doing that, and very rarely have we talked about fathers doing it. And, you know, everyone's doing that to some degree, you know, to a small degree. The interesting study found in Canada, which is the biggest nationwide study that's ever been conducted, and it's sort of the most official because it looks at actual, like, sort of child welfare cases. And it was done at about the turn of the century, so it's about 1999. The reason why it's still relevant is because all of the same arguments were going through the Parliament at literally the same time as this study was being done, which was there was this inquiry into family law and all of these testimonies saying that mothers always make up, you know, allegations of domestic violence, etc., to get the advantage. And this study came out, and what it found is that actually the vast majority of false allegations in the family law courts for neglect and for other types of abuse were coming from non-custodial parents, which were traditionally fathers. And we're talking about like 43%. The next group that were making false allegations was neighbours or extended family. The next group were mothers. And then I think it was about 2 or 3% were children. Like, sort of almost virtually unheard of that children were making false allegations against their parents. So I think it's not so much that, you know, women don't make up false allegations, but why are we always talking about women doing it? And I think that's the first clue you have to there's something wrong about that analysis. But it has been a very successful project from the anti-feminist men's groups since the 80s, who were annoyed at their wives leaving them, who could not believe that their wives would divorce them because suddenly they were able to. And losing that sense of control, a lot of these men got organised. And guess what? A lot of them didn't have kids, so they had time. The women, on the other hand, the mothers, they've really only very recently got organised even enough just to have a Facebook group. You know, they don't have anywhere near the political leverage to the point where, like, you know, I mean, there's a investigation in WA now, that awful murder of the family by the grandfather of the children, his wife and his daughter. You know, there's some, and I'd say very strongly, there are allegations, but after it came out that the husband of the daughter was actually abusing her, now he's convinced the WA department to investigate what role the family law court had in that murder. Like, that's absurd as a point of investigation. The grandfather murdered them. He's dead now. What are we going to find from investigating the family law court's role in that? But that's what, you know, even when the assassination of judges happened in the 80s, assassination of judges, their wives, blowing, you know, taking a bomb to the family court, the response from the media was like, have the family courts gone too far? You know, what could have driven a guy or whoever did this to do this? You know, however many years later, 40 years later or whatever it is, 30, how old am I? 37. 37 years later, we find that actually it was this one guy and he was abusive and he was just very frustrated that he wasn't getting custody. And so he went on this massive reign of terror that the media blamed the family law courts for. And I feel like saying the family law courts are like, so see how you were blamed for that? Can you see a little bit about how the people that you're dealing with, you know?
I know the registrar of the family court from that time, so I've heard his take on it, and it was frightening. I certainly
terrifying.
I think he thought that they knew all along who had done it, but it took a long time for it to be proved.
Could I just add something? Sure. My long experience in this field, the key, whenever anybody says a woman does it to privilege her in the family court, ask them, what good does it do a woman? What privilege, what advantage does it give a woman to say she's been abused in the family court? It does not give them any advantage. It disadvantages them. They've got to fight tooth and nail to prove that they're not vindictive, that their credibility is assured. It is a disadvantage. It is a sign of strength when a woman says, I agrees with the solicitor, yes, I want this evidence to come before the court. It never, ever, ever advantages a woman. Never advantages a woman. It's not to say that the evidence isn't accepted and her view is accepted and the abuse isn't accepted. Yes, that happens as it should. But it is, when we're talking about an advantage as if it's a tactical advantage, that does not happen. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard lawyer friends, that lawyer training I've been to, we talk about how this happens. I have been in training sessions with lawyers, and we're supposed to be there learning about domestic abuse. And sadly, I have, and there would be only a few there'd be, 60 that want to hear about what's happening for victims and survivors. But what I have heard is, women make this up, so that they're just all lined up at the ABO court just to privilege themselves. This is a message that sometimes comes from from lawyers' own training. So it's no wonder that the profession is confused, that the message out there is confused about what the real story is. Women do not get an advantage in the family court, and from my long experience also, the people that make up these stories are the perpetrators. And one of the ways we see, when our clients aren't telling us everything, if we get some documents, if we get a witness statement, affidavit from the perpetrator, that's where we see what he's been doing to her. Because they list, they go, she did this, this, and this. Okay, that's what happened. So, yeah, just ask anybody, what actually was the advantage?
Now, I have one more question for both of you before we open up questions to the audience. I've just appointed you Prime Minister, Jess.
Thanks.
And Lyndal is your Attorney General.
Fantastic democracy.
Yes, accepted.
You talk in the chapter on Fix It about some solutions. You're now Prime Minister. What are the first three things you're going to do?
I'm going to sell out first. No. Doesn't everyone? No. What are the first things that I do? Well, first, as Prime Minister, and the family law is a federal system, I will do what is needed to fix family law. There are a number of things that I want to, bore everyone with technicalities, but, there have been a number of inquiries, and I think there's a number of very good ideas. Now, as Lyndal mentioned, we're really dealing with a state-based law. For a lot of domestic violence, it's, domestic abuse. I still trip up on that and use, but anyway, both terms can apply. But is that you've got state-based laws that need to be changed state by state. So at the moment, I'm pretty involved in a way that is kind of uncomfortable as a journalist, but, I'm in now and I can't pull out, is that I'm involved in the sort of discussion around criminalising coercive control. So when we look to where that's been done overseas, in the UK, you have England and Wales do it, you have Scotland do it, you have Ireland do it. The whole country does it at once, whereas we would have to have New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, etc. So, in the same way that marital rape, when it was criminalised, I think in 1976 in South Australia, it wasn't until 1994 or so in Northern Territory that the whole of the country had criminalised that. So I think as Prime Minister, what I would do is I would hold at the next COAG, I would be getting the state leaders together and trying to have a unified front on criminalising coercive control. I would be pressing state leaders to hold their own inquiries state by state, making sure that everybody is heard and that all of the different state-based needs were taken care of. But I would not want to see a repeat of what happened with marital rape, but more importantly, what happened with intervention orders. The fact that you could get an intervention order in Victoria and it would not be applicable over state lines, until very recently when that system was made national. And the other thing that the federal government can do is open the wallet. And I'd say that what I would be really pressing for is fund the emergency, the crisis sector, so that we don't see a poverty mentality continuing in that area where everybody's sort of at each other because they're all fighting for grants and funding. Fund a sector that is going to respond to perpetrators and is actually going to, as so many people tell me, what is going to happen to him. I want him to go through rehab. I want something to happen for him, because otherwise, even if it doesn't work out with us, he's going to go on to the next woman. You can fix the victim situation, but if you just keep that guy sort of just criminalised or just exiled, he's just going to keep meeting new people and having new families. And that's what we see, serial offenders. And I would fix the housing situation, and then think that there is that housing is perhaps one of the most important things. It's the reason why we don't have access to refuge in the way that we used to. We have women going into motels, and maybe 4 or 5 nights plus later, maybe they get access to a refuge. But then if they don't have somewhere safe to live, they often have to stay in refuge, not just for 2 or 3 months, for 6 months, for a year, because so there's this bottleneck, and we need a refuge system. Is it perfect? No. Would we love to have a system in which we don't need refuge? Yes. But actually you need a specialised system that can protect and secure women and children who are under threat of homicide. And you also have women who, once they leave their partner, literally cannot afford to pay for the house they're in. So this system is still required. So they're the 3 sort of areas I would be looking at. 4, I think that is. Family law, perpetrators, the crisis sector, and housing.
Perfect. And Attorney General, what's your number one?
Well, I'm old enough to remember how the government changed... Here. Old enough to remember what we used to think about drinking. Have a drink for the road, drink driving. The government with an education program stopped that. Smoking. Fantastic education, fantastic regulation to address a serious health issue and societal issue. So the government can have effective regulation, effective community education campaigns that stop a pandemic of harm across this country. In a micro level, I'd flip the family court, as we all know, we've established that. But immediately, while I was getting all that together, I would be funding the family courts properly. In my view, it is deliberate that there is not enough judges. You go to the Supreme Court, there's not as big a weight as there is in the family courts. It exhausts survivors. It exhausts them financially, emotionally. And I would require the experts, the family consultants, anybody that has an opinion that is that is important to the family court, that is important about children's voices, I would make sure that they truly are qualified in identifying domestic abuse. And there's a lot of other procedural things that I would address. But they're the main ones. If I fix that, I'd be very happy.
Thank you. I'd vote for both of you. Now it's time for questions from the audience. In these COVID times, we don't have microphones in the audience. So if you could stand up and use your outside voice so that we can hear, and I will try and repeat the question if people can't hear them. So.
Hello, Jess. I listened to the audiobook during lockdown, and it was one of the most harrowing things I've ever listened to. And I think the way that you engage with your material and present it is so effective in that way. It really makes you feel it, and it makes you want to pursue it and engage further. One of the things that it did for me in lockdown was made me look around at my house and go, I'm so lucky. My husband, my children, I am safe. We're seeing all these hashtags, stay at home, stay safe. Home is the safest place. Close your door, shut yourself inside, do not leave your house. Fortunately, we're now moving out of that. The UK is going back in. The US has had a terrible time. I don't need to go on. I was just wondering if you and Lyndal could maybe comment a little bit on how the situation has been changed by COVID and how the landscape of domestic abuse might look when we, all settles down, we come out, poke our heads above the water and have a look around and see what's happening.
Now, the question was around our COVID times, and Jess was feeling very safe in her own home during ISO, but suspected that that's not the situation for everyone. And how has that impacted us more broadly?
Thanks so much for your question. There's certainly a lot of research going into this at the moment and trying to access people who are even in these situations to try to get a sense of what has changed for them. I mean, Lyndal sees a lot of things in terms of the clients that are coming to her now. What we hear from frontline services is that there's not only been an increase in reporting, but an increase in first-time reporting and an increase in the reporting of severe levels of physical or sexual violence. Interestingly, and this is where statistics can be so muddled, is that we were talking about before, there haven't been a huge surge in reports to police. For a while, there was actually a drop in reports to helplines. And so this is where you start putting context and common sense around statistics and start thinking about what are the restrictions or what are the reasons why people might not call police at a time like this or might not call a helpline when they may have been able to just sort of sneak away at work or, or go to the library or wherever it was deemed to be a safe place to call. Then there was a rise in calls to the helpline after midnight, or there was a rise in web chat. So there's all of these ways in which victim survivors are reorganising themselves, remembering that in this time, very unusually for a recession, it's been mostly women to lose their jobs. Usually in a recession, mostly men lose their jobs, but because of the nature of the sectors that lost out being hospitality, arts, it was mostly women. What's more alarming is that hundreds of thousands of women in Australia have actually left the workforce altogether since COVID first started. I think it was like 300 and something thousand. So at the heart of domestic abuse is financial control. Like 99% of domestic abuse situations, basically, I mean, all of them involve financial abuse, much higher than physical abuse. Financial control is actually the locus point. So if you have women who can't work or who have lost their jobs, like one woman I spoke to a couple of days ago, she and her husband have both lost their jobs. Her safety planner was saying, before you think about anything else, you need to get a job. You need to get money. You can't, and some women, of course, will leave with $1.50 in their back pocket or less. But when you've got 4 kids, they're the sorts of things you need to be thinking about. So at the moment, I think when we stick our heads up and look around after this, I think it will be difficult to really, quantify. But certainly we're going to see frontline services continue to struggle to meet demand, probably not get even funded enough to meet the pre-COVID demand, let alone what's increasing, and whether or not we're going to see some huge spike when everyone goes back to work, for example, and coercive controllers lose control over that element of their lives, or is yet to be seen. But certainly in the UK, we saw a giant spike in homicides. It was like 5 in 1 week at one point, and the average is about 2 a week. And going back into lockdown now, it's very concerning what that's going to produce.
Lyndal, have you seen an increase in matters coming to you?
Yes, without doubt. There's been a big increase in a good way in a lot of ways. There's been in our experience, there's been women really looking. They've been forced to look at what's actually going on at home and making decisions about. The children are often have been homeschooled, so it's the children have been subjected to it in a relentless way. So a lot of clients that are coming to us at the moment have made this just cannot go on. So, but that's for the women that can leave safely, are trying to leave safely. I think the reporting for the police that's dropped. I would like to see. The reality of that, because reporting for the police happens in a number of ways, and it doesn't. A survivor, a victim, can go into a police station or ring the police, and it can just be written down on a piece of paper in their notebook. That is not a report. So it'll be very interesting to see what's actually happening in the notebooks. My second point about that is that. As Jess said, that there can be an opportunity when the perpetrator's not around to make calls, but there's another aspect to that too, is that the propaganda that has not been able to operate for a few hours. Her brain might be actually tick in a certain way, whereas when the perpetrator is home, there is all that monitoring of her behaviour. There's also that psychological thing. There's never a release from it. So there might be actually less reporting, but I'd like to see what the docs' records are. I'd like to see what their records are.
They're bad.
Yeah, they're bad. There you go.
And there's a lot of... I'm being contacted from people inside docs saying that there's uninvestigated abuse of children because everyone's so busy with everything else. But I think that's really interesting, what you say about that grip on her mind when she goes to work, and the fact that, there's, I think, any one of us, look at the fact that so many of our distractions have melted away, or when I say distractions, lives, social lives, and, being able to be in a workplace even with people or whatever it is, and you do go quite introspective, so that might be that because you get no space at all, you are doubling down into the system, or it might be that it starts to get so bad and you don't have that outlet anymore to go and have some space away that you're like, I can't take this anymore.
That's exactly what we're seeing, I think, Jess.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's really interesting. That's the thing is, so much of this is, there's a great Michael Haneke film called Code Unknown, and, it's basically the whole moral of its story is that sometimes, we think, coronavirus, really terrible global pandemic, awful time for 2020. But Code Unknown is sort of like, yeah, but what shifts in the system does this start to create that has unexpected consequences or results? And maybe one of those results is Donald Trump did not get a second term. Maybe I remember sitting with former white supremacist at an Adelaide Book Festival earlier in the year in March before lockdown. Well, we were on a panel with George Megalogenis. So, and we were talking about COVID. It had just started to become sort of a real threat, but we were all still out in public and everything. We had no idea what was about to happen. And he was saying, I think COVID will help Trump because it's he is about the economy is going to go down, and he's going to be able to avoid responsibility for that because he can blame it on COVID. And my personal opinion was like, no, he's the emperor's new clothes are going to be stripped off him once COVID comes through because he won't be able to respond to it, and he won't be able to respond to it because he's a narcissist. And the idea of even admitting that there's an illness around that you'd have to wear a mask for would be just totally against his ethos, let alone their complete, inability to run things. And, lo and behold, I mean, who knows? Who knows what COVID might end up meaning for climate change action internationally? This is the thing. So we don't know what little, flap of the butterfly's wing leads to possibly positive outcomes, not all negative.
And on that note, I think we'll have to wrap up our session. Maybe we'll come back next year and talk about it some more. Jess will be available to sign copies of her book. It's just out near the festival bookshop opposite the library cafe, just left of the room. Obviously, keep maintaining your 1.5 metres apart, sanitise the pens between sessions. We need to ask you to leave the room as soon as the session is over because we need to actually get it ready for the next session, obviously sanitise it, etc. Look, I thank you all for coming. I thank Lyndal and Jess for their time. It's been a fantastic session from my perspective. And I'd really like to recognise Bad Sydney for putting on a festival in these COVID times. Absolutely. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Amanda.